Hey, good evening. We got some going out and some coming in.
What I get, I call Bryson out Sunday.
Oh, and then you come in after. Yeah, that's the way. One of the things I've learned is I try my best not to call anybody out on anything, no matter what it is, because sure enough, that's what will happen. Yeah.
I'm learning.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Kind of reminds me of what Jesus says: is be careful of the judgment that you hold on others, because that's the same that's going to be replied back to you. And I'm like, okay, no judgment. Okay. All right. So we are in Luke chapter 5, verse 17. We're going to read 17 through 26, and we'll come back and discuss the paralyzed young man here. On one of those days, as he was teaching, Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there, who had come from every village of Galilee and Judea and from Jerusalem. And the power of the Lord was with him to heal. And behold, some men were bringing on a bed a man who was paralyzed, and they were seeking to bring him in and lay him before Jesus. But finding no way to bring him in because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and let him down with his bed through the tiles into the midst before Jesus. And when he saw their faith, he said, "Man, your sins are forgiven you." And the scribes and Pharisees began to question, saying, "Who is this who speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" When Jesus perceived their thoughts, he answered them, "Why do you question in your hearts? Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven you,' or to say, 'Rise and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the man who was paralyzed, 'I say to you, rise, pick up your bed, and go home.' And immediately he rose up before them, picked up what he had been lying on, and went home, glorifying God. And amazement seized them all, and they glorified God, and were filled with awe, saying, 'We have seen an extraordinary thing today.'" All right, so we have this is a pretty common story. I think probably most of us have read or have talked about a couple of times, the paralytic where his friends take and dig a hole in the ceiling so they can get the young man down to be close to Jesus, because there's really no other way to get to him, right? And they bring the paralytic there. What is the reasoning? Why did they bring this young man who's paralyzed to Jesus? To be healed, right? It says specifically there in verse 17, it says, "And the Lord is with him to heal," right? So some healing, obviously we know before this, Jesus had been healing. He'd been casting out the evil spirits. He'd been doing those things. He's also teaching. In this particular instance, they're trying to get this paralytic man to Christ, to Jesus, so he can be healed. And they can't do it because of the crowds, right? And so whenever they lower the man down, Jesus says, "Oh, I know what you're here for. Boom, be healed and go." Is that what happened?
He told them his sins are forgiven.
Right.
Stirred up the other guys.
So if you're there as the paralyzed man, right? You're there as the paralyzed man. You come there for healing. And Jesus says, "Your sins are forgiven you," and then just kind of goes on about his business. How do you reckon the paralyzed man felt whenever that was the immediate response? Yeah, right? It's like, well, thanks and all, but that's not what I'm here for, right? He was there because he was paralyzed. He couldn't walk, right? And so, he comes to this guy that he knows has been healing people, and this healer, right, it just says, "Oh, your sins are forgiven you," and then just kind of appears to just sort of go on, right, and not really address the main reason that he's there, right? And you just imagine if you're the parent, it's like if you go to the doctor to get something fixed, and they say, "Oh, well, I'm glad all four of your tires are up and are filled with air," and then they don't address anything that you're there for, right? It's completely out of kind of off left field from where the paralyzed man is thinking. It's something that's completely out of context. But why does he say it?
Because the Pharisees are there.
Right. The Pharisees are there. He's not saying it necessarily for the benefit of the paralyzed man, even though the paralyzed man, the benefit is in the forgiveness more so than what is in the healing, right? And there's a key point for us to touch on that. But he's saying it for the paralyzed man's benefit and then for the hearing of all of the Pharisees, right? And we have Pharisees from three different main districts. You got Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem. Right? So you got Pharisees from these three significant population centers that are there. And they hear Jesus say that. So, of course, what is their immediate reaction? Right. And do they call him a blasphemer?
When they say
They think it, right? Right. So it's not that they say it out loud, but it says when Jesus perceived what they were thinking, right? So when you can take that in a lot of different ways. You can take that by him reading their body language, or by just being, having the Spirit of God and being God himself in flesh, that he could read their mind and knew what they were thinking. However way you want to take it, miraculously, he knows what they're thinking, right? And that's one of the key things, for us. We may say prayers to God, but he knows our heart, right? You can't fool God. You can try to be silent about something, or you can pray to him about something, but he knows you're going to be able to use your words and your mind to be able to change or to hide something from him, right? So even if you have these Pharisees here who maybe they don't want to say anything, right? They're like, what is this guy doing? But it's all inside their head. But Jesus calls them on it, right? He knows the intention of their heart. And then he says, so that you may know, right? So this is the reason why he did what he did. He tells the paralytic to rise and take up his bed and go home. And so this is a great example of the use of miracles to support the teaching of God, right? What does the paralyzed man really need? What does he need?
Well, he's looking to be made whole again so that he can walk again.
That's what he's asking for, right?
That's what he's asking for, but he really needs as we all do, our sins forgiven.
Right. So he needs the sins forgiven, but he's asking for something a whole lot less, which is to be able to walk again, right? And Jesus obviously recognizes what he needs and gives that to him right off. But then that also stirs everybody up, and he knew it was going to stir everybody. That's why he did that in that direction, right? But then he uses the miracle to show everyone there, including the man who's paralyzed, the words that he's saying are true. They have power. They have divine authority. And when Jesus forgives sins, they're forgiven. They're gone. Right? So we have this great example of what's going on there. And then, of course, how the crowd and everybody responds to everything. Mm-hmm.
That was paralyzed, but
right.
the others all did.
Right. Yeah. So we have the paralytic here who has his friends that are helping him, right? And his friends and their faith, and I'm sure to some degree, the paralyzed man, it doesn't say his faith, but their faith. But so as the group, right, and his friends are helping him come to know or come closer to Jesus, and they're doing whatever it takes, right? It's a great example for us, for our friends. Are we doing whatever it takes to get people before Jesus? Are we doing whatever it takes so that our friends or for folks that we know have that opportunity to be in the presence of Jesus? And that's a great example for us to think about and to look at as we contemplate in our own lives of what we do. Absolutely, right? Right. The kind.
Risk their lives, because just climbing on houses, things,
Right.
pulling up,
Right.
that's dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, getting him up there and then figuring out some kind of apparatus to be able to lower him down. He's kind of got a lot of faith in them that they don't drop him. I mean, there's a lot of things that go on here, right? A lot of different layers and levels. They're willing to, it says lower him down through the tiles. So you get the idea they're digging out the roof to be able to drop him down in there. So they're, in a sense, vandalizing this person's house to be able to make it happen. And I've heard some people say and depict it as though, well, there's already a hole that's on the roof and they just lower him down through that. Might be the case, but yeah, I don't know. It just sort of depends on which account you look at and how they do that. But still, you've got the friends and their faith and their willingness to help their friend out, the paralyzed man, and you have this juxtaposition of we're here for healing, and Jesus says, "Well, your sins are forgiven." And again, for us, how many times do we go to the Lord and we're saying, I want or I need or I'm struggling with this, and He says, yeah, I know, but that's not what's important. This is what's more important, right? And then are we willing to accept that, right? Are we willing to believe that and to step out with what He is telling us we need to do? Because that's huge. So yeah, we have the response of the Pharisees, and then we have at the end of the whole thing, what does it say that seized them all in verse 26? They're seized with amazement, right? And they say, we have seen something extraordinary, right? So this is similar to what we saw in Acts chapter 3. I think it's Acts chapter 3 or 4, where Peter and John heal the young man who's been paralyzed for 40 years. And they say, there's no doubt. This is a true miracle. We can't deny it before the people. Everybody knows this guy. He's been around for 40 years. He's been paralyzed, and then they heal him. So it's something similar to that. They got this guy that's dropped right down in front of them all. They see that he's a paralyzed person, and then they see that Jesus heals him. So they're amazed, right? And so then now you got to think from the Pharisees' perspective, everything that they've held as being true and right, which would mean they need to kill Jesus right now because he's a blasphemer by saying he's God, he can forgive sins, is just now turned up on its head because now he's showing, no, I am God in this moment of healing. And that's hard, right? That's very difficult for us to just, let's just throw all of our tradition and our thought and our teaching and everything that's been handed down for, thousands of years. We'll just throw that out the window because this guy says so. We don't usually do that, right? That's not how we think. That's not how we operate. But then he does this miracle. So then you're like, well, wait a minute. Now we've really got to step back and pay attention to what's being said, right?
Verse 17, though,
Mm-hmm.
it sounds like the Pharisees and teachers came to hear Jesus because he had been healed.
Right.
They came to hear him.
Right.
They're the ones who were actually in the house.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, like most of the other examples, Jesus is talking to a crowd house.
Right.
He's inside with this specific group.
With this group, yeah.
Very large crowd too.
Right. Right. So much so that you can't get in. Right. Standing room only. Right. Yeah. And it's right on the heels, verse 17, of where Jesus has been trying to withdraw from the crowds. Right. But his reputation is getting out, what he's doing, what he's teaching, how he's teaching, what's happening, and then that draws in these Pharisees, right, and quite a few of them, such that they're there to find out, well, who are you? By what authority, by what name, all those kinds of things. What are you teaching? And then, essentially, they're triggered because of what he's teaching is just completely goes against what they know to be right and true. And then they're like, but God just allowed him to do this. So that everything gets turned upside down for him.
Do you not think that's what the Pharisees are there for, to try to find something that they weren't there
Great
for
potential.
our heart,
Yeah.
possibly.
There's a great potential of that.
Hey, let's see what he's
Right.
calling out.
Because many, many, many times, what do they say? They say, let's go catch him in something, right? Or they'll send somebody down and say, hey, go catch Jesus in something that he said. That we see that several times, right? Doesn't necessarily set it up that way here, but that doesn't mean that's not the case.
But you just
Right. We know that every time they're there,
assume like you are.
right, just like they did John the Baptist. Right, exactly. Yeah, you kind of expect that that's going to be the case because that's the way they've operated the whole time. With John the Baptist, with Jesus' disciples, with Jesus himself, they're usually there not to sit at the feet of Christ and learn, but rather to figure out and pick ways to say, oh, well, what you're saying is wrong, is false, you're blaspheming, those kind of, how do we shut him up, is more of their reasoning, right? All right, so let's take a look at, we've seen Peter, we've seen the leper, we've seen the Pharisees, and now we've seen the paralytic, right? Y'all remember, what was Peter's response to Jesus? Remember, this is maybe a month ago we talked about it, but just a few verses up, and Jesus uses Peter's boat, right? and he gets in the boat. He preaches and teaches from the boat, and he tells Peter, "Hey, go put your nets out into the deep." And he's like, "Look, we've been fishing all night. We didn't catch anything, but because you say so, I'll go do it." And then they catch so many fish, it starts breaking the nets and starts sinking the boats. And then they come back to the shore, and then what does Peter say? Yeah, he says, "Depart from me, get away from me. I'm a sinful man. I don't need you. I'm not worthy, rather, of having you around me," right? So that's Peter's response to Jesus, right? What else do we see about Peter? He says that he recognizes or feels unworthy before Jesus. What else?
To me, he's an honest man.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to be honest. He
Yeah.
recognizes the power of Jesus.
Yes.
Because not anybody can just go out there and
Right.
do
Yeah.
what he's doing,
Mm-hmm.
what he said, and then Jesus asked him to follow him.
Right.
Let me know. I'm not worthy to even be in the
Right.
boat with you, basically.
Yeah. He's honest enough to recognize and state those things and realize, one, who Jesus is. He calls him master, right, teacher. And then he takes it a step farther because now he's saying, I'm not even worthy to be in your presence, which means he's beginning to recognize the deity of Christ, right? He's beginning to recognize who Jesus really is. He at the very least catches a glimpse of that, to recognize that whatever you are and whatever God is in you or doing through you, I'm not worthy of that, right? So that's one of the key things that comes out with Peter in this particular spot. What else does we learn about Peter here? Yeah. He leaves everything. And when does he leave everything? Right then. And what did they just do?
The most profitable thing he's ever had.
Yeah. The best commercial fishing day he's ever had, right? Right when business is just hit a huge boom, and he's got all the fish that he could ever think about catching, right? And he's like, okay, let me drop that and just follow you.
I think about Peter as like the parable of the soil or the rock. To me, he's like the most fertile ground.
Mhm.
His representation of who he was.
Yeah.
He's so self-reflective and grounded in who he is that
Mhm.
it almost comes across in the way he's described as a emotional to a point. Like
Yeah.
he wears it on his sleeve. He is
Right.
who he is. It is what it is. He
Right.
has no bounds, no shame of what
Mhm.
right or wrong. He lays it out
Right.
there. And that's
Right.
kind of what makes me think of that fertile ground. It just
Yeah.
takes it.
That honesty that he brings to every conversation, right? Everything that he does or says, you know where he stands because he doesn't hide anything or it's out there, right? Yeah, absolutely. What he feels is what he does. And like you said, wearing it on his sleeve. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, we also see in the situation with Peter, he has help from his friends too, right? Because we have James and John, the sons of Zebedee, they're there with him as well. And they help him with bringing in the haul and all that kind of fun stuff. And obviously, James and John also become apostles, right? That follow after Jesus during that time. Yeah. So we know that they become apostles as well, and they leave everything, their nets, and they follow after in this same account. I think it's one of the other Gospels that actually names them as ones who drop the nets and go with him. But essentially, that's this same account that's happening here. And so Peter, James, John, all of them are called right then and respond and follow Christ. Again, right at the height of their success. They've got all this that they've made. They drop it. They leave it to follow Christ. We see his recognition of unworthiness, his honesty, and then also we saw in here his obedience. Right? That's out. He was reluctant. Again, he tells him, hey, we've been doing this all night. We ain't caught nothing. But because you say so, I'll do it. Right? So he is willing to be obedient even in spite of not quite understanding. Right? What do we see about the leper? What are some of the characteristics of the leper? What did he recognize about Jesus? Yes. he recognizes Jesus' ability, right, to heal him. Because he says right there in verse 12, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. He recognized that in Jesus. So he sees in Jesus that, similar to like what Peter saw, that's the supernatural aspect, right, that goes above and beyond what mere mortals, mere human beings can do. He recognizes there's that divine quality in Jesus, right? Both of them, Peter calls him master. The leper calls him what? Lord, right? So both are in a very high level of respect, right? You don't just call everybody that you run into on the street master or Lord, right? And the idea that Peter is talking about with master up here, I believe, is more in line with like teacher to a degree. But we have master, and then also the leper calls him Lord. They both recognize his supernatural capability, his divine nature, if you will. They both see the glimpse of that. And then what else is interesting about the leper?
Well, he tells him not to tell the people,
Yeah.
but to go and show the priest.
Mm-hmm.
And then, to let them know. But it still gets out. And to me, him going and showing the priest and so forth, I think that's why later on up here
We see the Pharisees and everybody coming down.
together at his house.
Right. Right.
You've got the Pharisees and the teachers and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and the people are going to get out of their way to let them come in
Right.
because they're the
Right.
take care of worship and all that. And that's
Mhm.
why they're all in the house and all the people are crowded around.
Right. Right. Yes, sir. And you know that the things like this with the leper, with the big catch of fish, with all the other people that are being healed and evil spirits being cast out, that's going to draw in the religious elite to confirm, well, who is this that's doing this stuff, right? But what's one of the aspects here that the leper brings out when he says, if you will, you can make me clean?
So that's showing his faith.
Yes, his faith. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, his faith, because he recognizes the divine ability that Jesus has, but then he also is willing to be subject to the will of Jesus. Right?
He's accepted.
Right. Right. He, if you will, we look back at like Peter. Peter says, depart from me, for I am unworthy. Right? The leper recognizes and knows he's unclean and he's unworthy. And he's like, but if you will, Lord, you can make me clean. I recognize your ability to do that, and if it's your will, then, I would really like for that to be the case, right? But he's also willing to continue as being the leper. You know what I mean? He's not coming in and demanding. He's not coming in or anything of that nature. He's not, but he's saying, your will be done, right? And that is a huge and also difficult thing, especially when we're in the same kind of position that the leper is in. I mean, that's huge. That he's willing to just be subject to Jesus' will. Obviously, just like all of us, hoping, right, that his will be that he would be cleaned, right, that would receive what we're asking for, right? But yeah, absolutely. So he like Peter, recognizes the divine. He, like Peter, recognizes his unworthiness, and like Peter, is willing, if you will, to be subject to what Jesus' decision is. Now, one of the differences here between the leper and Peter is we don't see any friends here with the leper, which makes sense, right? I mean, that only makes sense because people aren't going to be hanging out with the leper, right? They're trying to stay away from him. But it would also make sense because we have the other story where we have the 10 lepers, right? Where you have a group of lepers who probably would be together, right? And in this individual's case, he is on his own, but we see the strength and resolve of his faith and of his willingness to be subject to Jesus' will. And so he's able to step out on that and doesn't have the friendship and the social support system that some of the other folks have. All right, and now we come to the paralytic, right? What do we learn about this young man who's paralyzed? What all does he say? He doesn't say anything, right? He doesn't come. He doesn't make any statements about Jesus. He doesn't, say anything at all, right? Right. He doesn't do much of anything at all, right? Exactly. He's paralyzed.
Yes, he showed his faith if he left him.
Right. We know that there's something there, right? Because otherwise, he probably would have, not allowed his friends to do all those things, right? And so we know that there is something there, but we don't hear him say anything.
Just that he went home glorifying God.
Right, glorifying God right at the end. True. And he does take up his mat after Jesus, tells him to, right? But throughout that, he's basically silent. He's not really expressing anything that's recorded here, right? And it's because of his friends and because of his social support group there that he is able to come before Jesus, right? Because they're able to make that happen for him. So when we look at these three, we see two of the examples where there's a good support group of friends that are working with the individual and recognizing and pointing to Jesus, right? And then we see faith that's in all three of them. We see all three of them recognizing the deity and the supernatural power that Jesus has and that he brings to the situation. And then in all three of them do seek, if you will, Jesus for help, with the exception to a degree of Peter in this particular instance. Because Peter isn't seeking Jesus out. Actually, Jesus is there because Peter's there. So Jesus is there to seek Peter out, right? Which is kind of a little bit of a difference there. Now, what is, obviously, how are the Pharisees described? Unbelieving, right? So they aren't there, kind of like what Riley was talking about. They're not there to fall at the feet of Jesus and learn. They're there to find and poke holes in his arguments to try to shut him up, right? And get him back and get this good Jewish boy back in line where he's supposed to be, right? Because he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, right? And then, when they come to him, there's accusations that are there. There's disbelief that's there. But then they also have a social network of friends, right? They're all there together supporting each other in all this, right? And so in both instances, you have influence of the friends that are around them, right? And in two instances, it's a good positive. And then in the other instance, it's not, right? So then obviously, to me, we want to be in that positive friend group that's pointing people to Jesus, pointing people to Christ, in every opportunity that we have. And then when we recognize those friends that are in that friend group that are not and that are pulling away, then we want to, pump the brakes on that, not go hang out and spend time there, right? But be with the people who point us to Christ and point us to Jesus, and be the people that do that, right? So we look at these different individuals that are characterized and that are brought through in these different aspects here. The next part, verses 27 through 32, we'll get into next time, but that's where he talks about Levi. And we're going to look a little bit at Levi and how he's described, and then what he brings to the table as well. All right, any points or comments for the class? Sorry.
What he said about, well, I'm reading it right here.
Mm-hmm.
About the very best comment he got, if he's still talking about describing the Pharisees, is we've seen some strange things here today.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
That's as complimentary as they got.
Right. They've seen something extraordinary, something strange, something they can't describe or explain, right? Yeah. What are you going to say to it?
Well, just, the Pharisees, from what I understand, the Pharisees assumed that if you had some major physical problem, because of sin.
Yeah.
And so he starts with,
Your sins are forgiven.
but the healing doesn't come. I think he's, by doing it that way, he's partly showing that they don't go together.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Because a man with forgiven sins can still be paralyzed.
Right. Yes, sir. Very good. Very good point. So the Pharisees, they assumed if you had a malady, a physical malady, it was because you had sin. Right? And what Stuart's pointing out is, well, your sins are forgiven, but you're still paralyzed. So it's not because of sin that you're paralyzed. And then he does the healing to help challenge, again, their traditional thinking, right, to pull them out of that and start to break free from the traditional ways of thinking and get really back to the way God teaches. Because if you go through the old law, that's not what it teaches, right? That was just their traditional way of thinking. All right. Thank you all very much. Have a good evening.